The room was tense as Gorak scoffed, squinting at the screen in disbelief. Around him, the Karu delegation muttered in uneasy agreement. Every Deathworld species had gathered on Z-Prime, a neutral meeting ground for the few life forms tough enough to survive planets that actively sought to kill them. Brutal terrains, vicious predators, and toxic atmospheres were familiar challenges to the Karu. They thought they understood resilience. They thought they had seen the pinnacle of endurance, and then they encountered the humans. On the main screen of the conference room, a grainy video feed played. A human, lean, scarred, and alarmingly casual, was strolling across a scorching desert under twin suns. The sensor readings flashed along the side of the screen, searing temperatures, wind speeds lethal to most species. And yet, there he was, just walking. "I don't get it," growled Iroh, a scaled Karu warrior with a scar running from his forehead down to his jawline. He was known for his steely resolve, but right now he looked genuinely puzzled. "They aren't armored, don't have any venom, and lack claws. What do they have? Bones?" The others nodded. The Karu, proud descendants of survivalist evolution, had never encountered anything like the humans. The Karu were tough, yes, built to withstand toxic environments and injuries that would easily incapacitate other species. They were muscular, dense, and armored in natural plating. In short, they were the galaxy's undisputed masters of harsh living. Or so they thought. One of the delegates, a scientist named Drek, piped up, clearly disturbed. "The data suggests they don't only survive on their home world. They thrive. Their planet, Earth, is like nothing we've ever studied." Gorak grunted, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Elaborate, Earth," Drek said, visibly trying to suppress his disbelief, "has a highly unstable environment. Extreme cold and heat, unpredictable weather, active volcanic zones, vast chaotic seas. Nothing about it is hospitable. Yet humans have adapted to almost every corner of it. They even go so far as to challenge it intentionally, climbing its highest mountains, swimming in its deepest waters, or venturing to its poles for entertainment." The room went silent. Entertainment. That concept was not lost on the Karu, who relished proving their own strength. But to seek out danger on purpose? Ridiculous, Iroh muttered. "They're either insane or lying." "I thought so, too," Drek admitted. "But there's more." He hesitated, as if reluctant to share the next piece of information. "Earth is a true death world by the strictest definition. Not like Karu. The predators there are dangerous, yes, but it's not an apex world. There are no toxins in the air, no catastrophic magnetic storms. Then why call it a death world?" Someone sneered. Drek took a deep breath, tapping on his tablet. "Because humans themselves are the threat. They're aggressive in ways we don't fully understand. They don't just survive, they dominate. They form packs, create weapons, and adapt faster than any species on record. They've encountered creatures that would kill most other Deathworlders, and they've figured out ways to subdue, or even befriend them." A hologram popped up, projecting images of various Earth animals, massive felines, creatures with crushing jaws, and towering mammoths. At the center of each image was a human, grinning and undaunted, standing next to these beasts as if they were allies. Gorak watched, his skepticism fading, replaced by reluctant intrigue. "You're saying they train these things?" "They don't just train them," Drek replied, his voice lowering. "They make them companions. They bond with them. And it's not just beasts. Their technology, while primitive compared to ours, is modified for any environment. And it's their tenacity. They don't stop, even when outmatched, even when injured. Humans just keep going. It's like survival itself is hardwired into their instincts." The Karu exchanged glances, each warrior grappling with the realization that perhaps they had underestimated these strange beings. For as long as any of them could remember, the Karu had considered themselves the standard by which survival was measured. They were not accustomed to feeling threatened, especially not by a species without natural defenses. Then the door to the chamber slid open, and the human ambassador walked in. He was nothing remarkable at first glance, about the height of a Karu juvenile, unarmored, with a sturdy frame that seemed laughably fragile next to the massive, armored Karu figures in the room. But there was something unsettling in his gaze. His eyes scanned the room with a calm intensity, an unspoken confidence that unnerved the Karu more than any weapon could. "Gentlemen," he greeted, his voice steady. He had no translator. He spoke the Karu language fluently, a feat that took even seasoned diplomats years to master. "I appreciate the warm welcome." Iroh's lip curled as he eyed the human. "You're lucky we allowed you here, human. We don't usually waste time with soft-skinned creatures from garden planets." The human ambassador simply smiled, unfazed. "I'd imagine not. Then again, I'd wager most species don't survive long enough to have that conversation with you." That earned a few begrudging chuckles from the Karu side, though Iroh's expression remained stony. Drek, always the scientist, couldn't resist pressing forward. "Tell us, human, how is it that your kind has endured on such a world? Without armor, without claws or fangs?" The ambassador shrugged, as though the answer were obvious. "We adapt. We think our way out of situations. Sometimes we fight. Sometimes we wait. We know that brute strength isn't everything." Iroh's brow furrowed. "Strength is survival. Strength is survival when there's no other option," the human replied. "But on Earth, survival is just the beginning. We learn, we build, we form alliances, we take risks because it's in our nature. That's why we're here, speaking with you." The Karu delegation exchanged wary glances. The human was bold, but he wasn't boasting. His tone was calm, steady, almost matter-of-fact. And yet, Gorak interjected, breaking the silence. "Immortal, breakable. If what we hear is true, your people suffer loss, pain. How do you manage such fragilities?" The ambassador paused, looking genuinely contemplative, as though this question went beyond mere physical limitations. He seemed to be searching for a way to explain something deeper. "We suffer, yes," he finally said, "but that suffering drives us. It's what makes us push forward to protect what we have. We fight because of it, and we build because of it. Our mortality reminds us that every second counts, that life is precious. And that's what gives us strength." Gorak's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The words made him uneasy. The Karu had long dismissed emotions as weaknesses, things that clouded survival instincts. But the human was saying the opposite, that fragility was a source of resilience. It was a notion that gnawed at the edges of Karu pride. Before anyone else could respond, a junior Karu warrior who had been standing guard stepped forward. "Enough of this talk," he snarled, impatience evident in his voice. "Let's see if this human is as tough as he claims." The room stilled. A challenge on Karu terms was no small matter. The human ambassador met the young warrior's stare without flinching. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he said, but then a glint sparked in his eye. "However, I'm not one to turn down a demonstration." Gorak raised a hand, signaling for silence. This was not part of the planned diplomatic exchange, and yet he couldn't deny the curiosity burning within him. The Karu warriors cleared a space in the center of the room, forming a loose circle around the human and the young challenger, whose name was Crag. Crag was infamous among the Karu ranks for his speed and strength. Even his elders watched him with a mix of pride and wariness. The idea of matching a human against him was almost laughable. The human ambassador shrugged off his jacket and stepped into the circle, wearing only a simple shirt and pants, clearly unimpressed by the hulking warrior sizing him up. "All right, Crag," he said, almost casually. "How do you want to play this?" Crag growled, cracking his knuckles with a sickening sound that resonated through the room. "Survive," he sneered, as if that alone would be impossible. He crouched, muscles rippling under his armor plating, his sharp gaze fixed on the human, ready to strike. The Karu watched in silence, some in anticipation, others with pity for the human, who seemed oblivious to the challenge he was facing. This wasn't just a test, it was almost a ritual among the Karu, a way to assert dominance and put other species in their place. But the human didn't flinch. Crag lunged, a blur of armored muscle and raw power. He swung a fist the size of a boulder, aiming directly for the human's chest, fully expecting to send him flying across the room. But the human sidestepped smoothly, moving with an agility that caught Crag off guard. Crag whirled around, his eyes narrowing. He charged again, this time faster, a blur of limbs and brute force. The human dodged each swing, every movement measured and precise. Crag's attacks were relentless, but the human slipped out of each one, his expression calm, almost amused. The car warriors began murmuring, some exchanging skeptical glances. This wasn't the outcome they had anticipated. The human was outmatched in strength, yet somehow he was holding his ground, maneuvering around Crag's attacks with unsettling ease. Crag, panting and visibly frustrated, threw a vicious punch, aiming for the human's face. But this time, the human didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped forward, catching Crag's wrist and twisting it, using the car's own momentum against him. Crag staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he was forced off balance. The room fell into stunned silence. The human released Crag and took a step back, watching him recover. "Strength isn't everything," he said, his voice cool and even. "Sometimes it's about knowing when and where to strike." Crag let out an enraged snarl, lunging forward in a final, reckless assault. But the human ducked low, pivoted on his heel, and swung his leg around in a sweeping motion. His foot caught Crag's ankle, and with a heavy thud, the towering car warrior crashed to the ground. The cars stared, jaws slack, as their fiercest young warrior lay sprawled on the floor. The human extended a hand toward Crag, who glared at him with a mix of shame and fury. After a tense moment, Crag grabbed the human's hand, allowing himself to be pulled up. The young warrior muttered something under his breath, grudging respect flickering in his eyes. The human ambassador turned back to the delegation, brushing off the dust from his shirt. "So, do I pass the test?" Gorak, who had watched the entire display in stunned silence, finally broke into a slow nod. "Perhaps," he admitted, his voice tinged with reluctant respect. "Perhaps we underestimated you." Drek, the scientist, seemed equally shaken. "You moved as though you could read his attacks before they happened. Is that training?" The human smiled, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Let's just say humans have learned to adapt quickly. We may not have natural armor, but we compensate with skill and strategy." The car exchanged wary glances. They had seen warriors with exceptional skill, but this was different. It wasn't just training. It was a calculated response to overwhelming force, an understanding of how to exploit even the smallest of advantages. The human had faced a car warrior and hadn't just survived, he had won. Gorak grunted, a look of consideration crossing his face. "Impressive human. But tell me, why do your people develop these skills? You said your world isn't a true death world. What need is there to hone such abilities?" The human leaned against the edge of the meeting table, his expression thoughtful. "Earth might not be a death world by your standards, but survival there isn't always easy. We face challenges both from the environment and from each other, and in a way that makes us unpredictable." The room fell silent again. The car prided themselves on being prepared for any threat, any challenge. But unpredictability, that was new, something outside their usual framework of strength and endurance. The human continued, his voice steady and calm. "We've learned that adaptation isn't just about the physical. It's about how we think, how we approach problems, and how we can change our strategies when things don't go as planned." The younger car shifted uneasily, while the older warriors watched with narrowed eyes. For them, the world had always been simple, strength meant survival. But this human spoke of survival as something else entirely, a complex web of thought and action. And in that moment, they began to see him and his people in a new light. One of the older Karu delegates, a seasoned warrior with countless battles under his belt, spoke up, his tone skeptical. "If humans are as resourceful as you say, why haven't you dominated the galaxy already? Why haven't you sought to conquer and control other worlds?" The human's eyes met the warrior's unblinking. "It's not about control," he said simply. It's about coexistence. We don't need to dominate others to feel strong. We understand the value of cooperation, of alliances. It's what keeps us growing, evolving, because alone, we're vulnerable. Together, we're unstoppable. The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the car way of thinking. Cooperation was seen as a weakness, a crutch for those who couldn't stand alone. But for humans, it seemed it was a strength, a form of resilience that went beyond brute force. Drek's analytical mind raced as he considered this perspective. So, you're saying humans use cooperation as a form of survival? The human nodded. Exactly. We understand our limits. We know that there are things we can't accomplish alone, and we're willing to admit that. By working together, we overcome obstacles that would otherwise be impossible. The car mulled over this, each one processing the implications. To admit weakness, to rely on others, that went against everything they had been taught. Yet here was a creature from a so-called lesser world, standing before them alive and victorious, speaking of unity, as though it were a shield as strong as any armor. Finally, Gorak spoke again, his tone measured. Perhaps there is more to humans than we realized. You possess strength, even if it's not the kind we understand. You have earned our respect. The human ambassador inclined his head, accepting the gesture with quiet dignity. Thank you. Respect is mutual. I came here not to challenge, but to learn. And maybe if we're open to it, we can both walk away stronger. The Karu delegation fell silent, each member deep in thought. For the first time, they considered that strength might not be as simple as they had believed. Strength, the human had shown them, could take many forms, and perhaps even the greatest Deathworlders had something to learn. But the meeting was not over yet, and the human ambassador still had one more message to deliver. He stood in silence, sensing he had finally earned the Karu's attention. But he knew his next words would challenge them even further. Before I leave, he said, looking around the room, there's something else you should know about Earth. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Humans aren't the only dangerous species there. The Karu stirred, shifting their massive forms as they glanced at each other. Gorak narrowed his eyes, a trace of suspicion in his gaze. Explain, he said cautiously. The ambassador continued, his tone still calm, but carrying an edge. Earth is home to countless species that would be considered lethal on any other planet. Our oceans alone are filled with creatures whose venom or strength could bring down a carb. There are predators in our jungles that hunt in packs, creatures in our mountains that strike without warning, and plants that can immobilize or poison you with a touch. Crag snorted, clearly unconvinced. So you share your world with beasts? We all do. The ambassador smiled, a faint, knowing expression that only deepened the Karu's curiosity. True, he conceded, but on Earth, we don't just live among these creatures. We've learned to coexist, sometimes to tame them, sometimes to avoid them, and when necessary to defeat them. We aren't the strongest beings on our planet, and we aren't the fastest. But we survive because we've adapted to understand them. We've even managed to harness their strengths to our advantage. Drek's eyes widened, the scientist's mind visibly racing as he absorbed the implications. You mean you use these creatures as weapons? Allies? The ambassador nodded. In a way. For centuries, humans have partnered with animals that would otherwise be our enemies. We ride beasts that can outrun any human, hunt with creatures that can smell prey from miles away, and use others to navigate the harshest terrains. Earth's life forms aren't just threats. They're part of our survival strategy. The Karu exchanged wary glances. This was something entirely foreign to their worldview. Karu didn't collaborate with other creatures. They dominated, controlled, or destroyed anything that stood in their way. But here was a species from a supposedly lesser world, describing an entirely different approach. Gorak folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Why tell us this, human? Why share these secrets with the people you barely know?